Hi guys, yes, this is my last day and it is my prerogative to be as spicy as I want to be, but don't worry, I'm not going to be too spicy. Okay, so when I present on domestic and family violence, I like to start with a bit of a story, because who doesn't love a story, even if it's super depressing? But I think it's a really nice way to just kind of remind ourselves that when we're talking about crime stats and survey results and things like that, we're talking about real people with lived experiences that are having a really tough time of things. And I mean, coming off the back of 5 presentations, you do definitely get that sense of, well, this is a discipline that is full of suck. Like, it just is really hard and nasty work, and I'm going to finish off with some domestic and family violence, but it's valuable, important work. So an alternative title for my presentation would be, why should we care about adolescent violence in the home, or adolescent family violence? And that's what I want to talk to you about today, about why we should care and why we should be trying to respond more appropriately to these types of cases. But now for a story. So Maria, not her real name, has 2 children, John, not his real name, and Claire, not her real name. So she separated from her partner, and about age of 12 or 13, John started to, as she said, go off the rails. He started hanging out with people that she did not approve of. He started drinking, partying. He started experimenting with pot, and he started talking about how crap school was. And considering that she's a high school teacher, that went over really well with Maria. But then his behaviour started to escalate a little bit as he got a bit older. He started to become verbally very abusive and aggressive towards Maria and Claire, and he started to do very significant property damage. So he would punch holes in walls, he would flip over furniture, he would burn things, he would smash laptops and TVs. And this just started to lead to real disintegration in the relationship between John and Claire and Maria. So one night they had a particularly spicy row, which ended up with him starting to destroy the property as he had so many times before. Maria took Claire and they hid themselves in a bedroom, and he took an axe to try and get into the bedroom and destroyed the door. So at this point, Maria did what she thought she would never have to do, and she called the police. And the police happily did a lovely job with John. They de-escalated the situation very well. They didn't put him in handcuffs, throw him to the floor or anything like that. They de-escalated it non-violently, and they had a really good conversation with him about his behaviours. So at this point, Maria said, so what's now? Like, what's the next stage of helping John kind of look like? And they basically said, we can arrest him if you want. And she said, well, no, I don't want to arrest my son. I just want him to know that these behaviours are not appropriate. I want him to get the help that he needs. And they said, we can arrest him, but we don't think that that's what you or your family needs. So there's something called restorative justice. Let's give that a go. So I spoke to Maria as part of the evaluation of the restorative justice program that Chris spoke about. And happily for Maria, RJ was a really good circuit breaker for her family. So at time of speaking to her about 18 months after participating in the program, she said that John had returned to school, that he was now living most of the time at home, that the violent behaviours had stopped completely, and she was in a much better place. And so was Claire, the younger sister, as well. But Maria's story is very typical in many respects, in that when she called out for assistance to the criminal justice system, they responded with, we don't really have something for John. So we can call child protection services, but it's not really, he's old enough now that he doesn't really fit within a child protection lens. We can call the criminal justice system, but you don't want to escalate his involvement in those kinds of systems. But he's not eligible for men's behaviour change programs, where it's not really something that you would put a protection order against him. There are no specialised programs for young people who use violence in the home. So I spoke to Maria a few years ago, but I've been speaking to victim survivors of adolescent violence in the home for the past 10 years, and the situation has not changed. There is a massive policy vacuum around young people who use violence in the home against their family members. And what I wanted to do with my presentation today is to kind of say, that's not good enough, and here are the reasons why we should care more about adolescent violence in the home. So number one, adolescent violence in the home is really, really common. So the best statistics that we have from New South Wales Police and Victoria Police and South Australia Police is that about 1 in 10 perpetrators of domestic and family violence who come into contact with them are young people, so under the age of 18 years. And that figure has increased significantly over the past 20 years. But we all know about that beautiful iceberg in terms of what is reported is not representative of what is actually really happening within the community. And certainly Maria did not report all of the incidents of violence that had occurred perpetrated by John against her and Claire. She only called once after about 2 or 3 years of significant and ongoing and escalating violence. So we don't have really good community estimates of adolescent violence in the home. As a general principle with domestic and family violence, we have pretty good statistics around sexual violence and intimate partner violence, but not really other forms of family violence. So when we talk about domestic and family violence, a lot of the time we're just talking about intimate partner violence. But we did a survey a couple of years ago of 5,000 young people in Australia who were recruited through online research panels, and this work was led by Kate Fitzgibbon and Silke Meyer, then at the Monash Centre for Gender-Based Prevention of Violence. And what we found is that 1 in 5 young people said that they had used violence against their family members prior to the age of 18 years, and that the average age of onset was 11 years old. And so that's a really young age for young people to start perpetrating violence, particularly when we know that the average age of young people who come into contact with the criminal justice system for these types of behaviours is about 14, 15 years. So we're only really capturing these young people through our statutory systems, our criminal justice systems, after a few years of them perpetrating these types of behaviours. But also what we know about these young people is that they're perpetrating violence on a fairly frequent basis. So about 1 in 2 were perpetrating violence against their family members on a monthly basis. So this was persistent behaviours perpetrated over a significant period of time. So reason number 2 why we should care about adolescent violence in the home is that it causes significant harm, not only for victim survivors, but also the young people who perpetrate these types of behaviours. So a huge body of research has started to really unpack the impacts of different types of domestic and family violence on victim survivors, and certainly these little dot points will not be unfamiliar to those of you who look at violence against women more generally, so things like social isolation, physical injuries, fear, financial stress, relationship breakdown. But some of these impacts are exacerbated when we're talking about adolescent violence in the home, because we're talking about people who are in primary carer positions sometimes in relation to their abuser. There is no option for respite. There is no option to remove them from the home for significant periods of time. And also there is a huge amount of guilt associated with these types of behaviours. I have spoken to so many people who've experienced different forms of domestic and family violence. Talking to carers and parents who experience these types of behaviours, there is this huge sense of guilt. Are they this way because of me? How could I have reported my child to the criminal justice system? How could I have been with their father who was abusive for so long? All of those kinds of things just really kind of add to all of those really negative impacts that we associate with other forms of domestic and family violence. So these are a couple of quotes that we've taken from different interviews that we've done with carers who have experienced adolescent violence in the home. So one says, mentally, it's been really difficult. I wasn't coping particularly well originally, so I ended up on antidepressants, which really helped because I was crying all the time. But it's exhausting, because I work full time as well, and it's physically exhausting. Some days I just sit down and I think I don't want to move, So that's been the hardest, is the fact I don't have any energy. And then another female parent said, I talked to my school because I started to have mental health issues, depression, tiredness, anxiety, and it started to impact my work. When the young person went missing, because this young person would abscond for periods of time, I was teaching here, running crazy to try and find him, and I come back to teaching, and so my principal, who knows her well, said, "Something is very wrong with you." So she had to take 6 months extended leave because of the stress and the trauma associated with the violence that was being perpetrated against her, which impacted her career progression, but also her earning capability. And it took a long time for her to be able to re-enter into the workforce as well. And that's one of the impacts we know is really significant for women and other people who experience adolescent violence in the home is reduced ability to work full-time and have secure employment. But we also know that violence in the home has significant impacts on young people who use these behaviours as well. And I don't have to tell this audience that we know that young people who have contact with the juvenile justice system are more likely to have subsequent contact with the adult criminal justice system, child protection services, and so on. And all of these systems have compounding negative implications for young people. But based on our research, we know that social isolation is really common amongst young people who use these types of behaviour. They're more likely to be at risk of homelessness because the families may ask them to leave and they may not have secure accommodation anywhere else. They have poorer education outcomes, they're less likely to have positive relationships with others, including their family members, and negative self-image and shame and self-harming behaviours. So these young people, because of their use of violence in the home, are on a really negative trajectory that can have really awful implications for them in the longer term, which can further entrench these types of behaviours. So these are young people who need help. And these are some quotes from young people who self-identify that they had used violence in the home. So the middle one really just breaks my heart because this one was from an evaluation we did in about 2013-14, and it was a 13-year-old boy who said, "I want to have better behaviour in the way I treat my mum and dad and brother and sister. When I get angry, I hit my dad, and he doesn't leave, he just sits there taking it. Then afterwards, I sit in my room feeling bad. Sometimes I hurt my brother and I feel bad that I hurt him or I'm going to hurt him. I want a more happy family." And that just always just breaks my heart. So reason number 3 why we should care about adolescent violence in the home is that it is often symptomatic of other underlying issues, including abuse and trauma. If a young person is using violence in the home, it's often because they need help. And there's stuff that's happened to them which is frankly just awful. And we view them as a perpetrator, but so frequently they're victims as well. So with the survey of 5,000 young people who we asked about their use of violence in the home, we also asked them about their experiences of abuse within their families of origin. So had they also witnessed abuse, had they been a target of abuse perpetrated by their family members? And controlling for other risk factors which we know are associated with use of violence in the home, we found that being a victim of abuse in the home, the predictable probability was 1 in 2. So if you had experienced some form of family violence, you had a 1 in 2 chance of perpetrating violence against family members. And in some cases, it's retaliatory. It's you've hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. Or it could be violent forms of self-defense. You come at me, I might punch you as a way of trying to de-escalate a situation or protect myself. But in other circumstances, it can be a reaction against Mum, you didn't protect me in the way that I wanted you to. It could be that I have all this rage and I don't know what to do with it, so I'm going to perpetrate violence against the people that I care the most about. There's a whole bunch of different, pathways between experiences of abuse and trauma and the perpetration of violence. And if we do not mitigate or at least support young people to manage the impacts of trauma and abuse, they are going to potentially go on to perpetrate these patterns of behaviour and on into the future. And just to kind of build on that, even in the absence of something like violence in the families of origin and abuse and trauma, we also know that there are a range of co-occurring issues that occur alongside the use of violence in the home. So things like mental illness and personality disorders, attachment issues, especially when it's exacerbated by removal from the home, drug and alcohol use, bullying in school, and contact with the juvenile system for other offending behaviours. And at this point, I just wanted to highlight that when we talk about adolescent violence in the home, we're typically talking about young people using violence against their female carers, because that's really what a lot of the research has been on. One area that we just have not even scratched the surface of is kinship carers. So these are young people who have potentially been removed from their home because of neglect and abuse-related issues. And they're placed with grandparents, they're placed with aunts, uncles. And so they're coming with this baggage of attachment issues and trauma and just all these horrible experiences. And then we're placing them with a family member and expecting that family member to be able to address and support that young person to not be violent in that circumstance. Kinship carers do not get as much support as foster carers, and I've spoken to a number of foster carers and kinship carers, and they feel completely under-supported and out of their depth in terms of managing the support needs of the young people who come into their care. But again, the guilt associated with reporting these young people because they know why they're perpetrating these behaviours. They don't want to be part of a system that fails them in terms of going, we failed you, you were abused, you were traumatised, you've come into this new family and you're perpetrating violence because of all of these unresolved issues. Now we're going to punish you by calling the criminal justice system. So that's just an area that really needs some additional research, but we just don't do it. Again, why we should care. So these are just some beautiful examples of the kinds of issues that some young people have when they perpetrate violence in the home. So this is one kinship carer who said the house was known for drugs. So obviously the police called around on a couple of occasions, and on one particular occasion the house was squalid, it was horrendous. I saw the photos and it was just horrible how they were living. So this was 3 boys that were removed and put into her care. They weren't being fed properly, they didn't go to school, they didn't have decent clothes to wear, and it was a complete breakdown. There was a lot of fights, a lot of swearing, and a lot of pornography. So they were being exposed to, you name it, they were exposed to it. So it's not obvious to anybody what they've been through. So these are kids who come with significant damage. But the final reason I just wanted to harp on about is that by stopping adolescent family violence, or AITH, we can stop the development of persistent and serious trajectories of harmful behaviour. So within criminology, there's the criminal careers kind of paradigm where we're really interested in understanding those pathways that people go through to become offenders. So what are those key events and milestones in their lives that leads them to having contact with the criminal justice system? We don't really do that within the intimate partner violence space or DFE space. We do developmental criminology. We're really interested in what's happening in the lives of these offenders during childhood. So are they victims of abuse, neglect, trauma? Is there the death of a family member? Those kinds of things. And then we're interested in them as adults. So what happens to them when they're 18 to 23? But that's a significant period of time in between that we don't really pay attention to them. So we wanted to do with one study was to kind of look at, well, is there a link between young people's use of violence in the home and their perpetration of these behaviours during young adulthood? So what we did is that we looked at a sample of young people who have been proceeded against by New South Wales Police for any offence over a period of time, about 10,000 young people, and we wanted to identify who'd been proceeded against for a DFE-related offence, a non-violent offence, and a violent non-DFE-related offence. So what we found is that young people who have been proceeded against for a DFE offence, so our AITH cohort, accounted for about 7% of our population, which is kind of commensurate with what we know about statistics. 58% of them went on to be proceeded against again for a DFE offence when they were an adult, so 18 to 23. So only a really short period of time, but 58% of them went on to be proceeded against. Compare that to young people who would use violence in other contexts, but not within their families, it was about 18% went on to be a DFE offender. But the biggest take home for me was that this cohort of 7% of young people accounted for 33% of all DFE offences perpetrated by that sample of 10,000 people. So 7% accounted for a third of all offending, DFE offending. So what this really tells me is that we are missing such an opportunity with these young people. We have a mechanism to engage with them. We are able to get them into potential programs and things like that before the age of 18. And we're not doing it. But if we did it, imagine if we could disrupt these trajectories of emerging violence with these young people. We could potentially be reducing domestic and family violence amongst our young adults by 1/3. So even if you look at it from a criminal careers perspective, if you take aside the fact that it's common, it's so harmful, and these are kids in distress, we could be saving ourselves so much money and pain in the longer term with this young cohort. So that's my passion piece in terms of why we should care about AITH. It's common, it's harmful, these are kids in need, and if you reduce it, then you could be just obliterating a huge amount of DFE offending amongst the adult population as well. So thank you very much.